Hello, everyone. I'm writing this for therapeutic reasons, but also as a warning to my fellow hunters and outdoor enthusiasts. My name is Aaron, and I live in rural Virginia. Although this experience has made me question my love for hunting and the outdoors in general, I'm still a country boy at heart, and I'll always love the outdoors and nature. I'm a hay and cattle farmer by trade, and I enjoy hunting and fishing whenever I get free time, which isn't very often, so it makes it all the more special. Around 3 years ago, one of my good friends that helps me on my farm put in a good word for me in our local hunting club, and I was voted in. I had been going hunting with him for a few years as a guest, but was really excited to be able to hunt clubland whenever I wanted. Our hunting club has 2 properties that we lease from year to year. The first property is local and close to home. It's around 200 acres and is loaded with deer, bears, and all kinds of wildlife. The other is about a 45-minute drive over a mountain dubbed Sperryville Mountain by locals and is only about 60 acres. The property is nicknamed The Orchard by our club due to the fact it was a thriving apple orchard up until the early 1970s. Unfortunately, now the property reminds you of a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Long gone are the beautiful and lush apple trees and scenic views, replaced by dead trees and foliage. Nasty-looking vines with long, sharp thorns cover each and every haunting tree. The only beauty left in our little 60-acre plot is a beautiful freshwater stream that flows out of the national park that our land borders. Sadly, deer, bear, or any wildlife for that matter, is scarce, and sightings are even more rare, mostly due to the fact the sun only shines on the property a few hours a day if it's lucky, causing a lack of food or vegetation to sustain wildlife. It's very easy to hunt here for weeks on end, without any animal sightings outside of the random bird or squirrel. You're probably wondering why in the hell anyone would waste their time hunting here. For me, it's simple. While the other members are hunting shoulder to shoulder on our other piece of property, I can drive over to the orchard and have nothing but peace and quiet surrounded by nature. Over the years, our fellow club members have tried to get us to give up the property-saving club funds in search of a better piece of land, but myself and another elderly gentleman named Rob persuade the others to renew our lease each year. Rob is a 70-year-old, heavy-set man with red cheeks and a snow-white beard. He always reminded me of good old Saint Nick. Rob is one of the original 3 founders of our club. The club was established in 1978, and the orchard was the first piece of land that our club acquired in 1979. I guess to him, the long-forgotten piece of land is sentimental, and I have to agree. He welcomed me into the club and took me under his wing, so to speak, always nudging me in the side and giving me that comforting wink, saying, "Boy, don't let the others discourage you. That place is right next to the park. A monster could wander down at any time." I have to say, I agree, because I've been fortunate enough to harvest a buck each of the last 3 years there. Nothing huge, but something tasty for my wife and I to munch on during the off-season. I still hold the orchard close to my heart because of all the good memories I've had with Rob and a few other friends. But after this experience, I refuse to hunt there alone. It was a clear, cool, crisp day in November with a slight breeze. I had just finished feeding the cattle for the final time that day, and I decided to load up my old 1989 Ford pickup with my ATV, backpack, and 6mm Remington hunting rifle and make the drive over the mountain. The drive over was uneventful, as I admired the changing autumn leaves and feeling the crisp, cold breeze through my window. I pulled into the property, full of hope of harvesting a nice buck, and parked in the lot at the bottom of the road, letting the tailgate down and unloading my four-wheeler, allowing it to warm up a few minutes before making the 20-minute drive to the tree stand. Sticks and rocks crackled under the weight of my ATV as I slowly drove up the rough old mountain road, passing the run-down, abandoned apple packing shed as I drove by. I had a good feeling in my gut that today may be the day I land that trophy buck and finally shut up the other club members for good. Arriving at the stand, I shut the engine off and looked around, listening to the soft breeze stirring up leaves around me. Taking off with my rifle on my shoulder and my backpack in hand, I began trying to tiptoe to the stand, trying my best to minimize the noise of my walking. But the dry autumn leaves that had made their trip to the ground had other plans. Making my way slowly up the rusty rungs of the ladder of Rob's old tree stand, I sat down and couldn't help but think about the massive 12-point buck Rob had shot out of this very stand 20 years earlier. His words were replaying in my mind over and over, like a broken record. A monster could walk down any time, as I would come to find out. This statement was more true than I could have ever imagined. Hours went by with nothing stirring but the occasional wind gust or noisy squirrel trying to stock up for winter. I was staying vigilant, checking for movement or noise in any direction, but to no avail. The cold autumn air nipping at my face and the deep sinking feeling in my stomach of another unsuccessful hunt was eating away at me. Checking my phone, the time was 4:55 p.m. About another 20 minutes, I said to myself. I always liked getting down to my truck before it got pitch black because I had a 20-minute ride back, and there was zero cell service in case an emergency arose. Directly to the west of the old tree stand was a steep cliffside covered in huge rocks and boulders. I scanned each and every rock for movement. Reaching down into my backpack and removing my lukewarm Mountain Dew, I took a sip before putting it back. I began looking back up towards the rocks, and that's when I saw it. Horns. My heart began racing, and I began sweating through my winter clothes. This is it, I told myself. All this hard work is about to finally pay off. Raising my rifle and looking through the 3x9 scope, the deer appeared to be an 11 or 12-point buck. The animal made its way down slowly and carefully through the rocks until it was maybe 150 yards away. Although all I could see was antlers, I knew in my heart this was the moment I'd been waiting for since I was a kid. All my excitement began melting away like cheese in a microwave as the creature stood up. What I saw was truly a monster and not the kind I wanted to see. What I was looking at was something that was 7 to 8 feet tall, skeletal build with long arms and a strip of brown fur running down the length of its back. But the most terrifying part was, its head was a deer skull with no hide. Time stood still as I watched this thing through my scope. It began shuffling around and struggling with something like a soccer mom fumbling with bags of groceries as she tried to remove them from her overpacked minivan. I always believed in Bigfoot, but this thing made Bigfoot look like a puppy. It was the most hideous thing I've ever laid eyes on. I finally saw what it was fumbling with. In its right hand was a squirrel, limp and lifeless. The monster began squeezing the poor creature as its eyes were pushed out of its sockets from the pressure. Like some kind of fucked up butcher in a deli, the monster laid the squirrel on a rock and with its massive claws began carving the poor animal up. Blood and organs spilled out of the animal, and, to my horror, the creature stuck out a long snake-like forked tongue and began devouring the squirrel. Lowering the gun, I was snapped back into my senses. "Don't let this thing see you," is all I could think about. I internally prayed that this thing would just turn and walk back into the park and be nothing but a memory, but it didn't. After finishing its meal, it looked around and stuck its tongue in and out like a cobra, as it were smelling. I was quickly reminded of how dire my situation was, as I noticed the darkness beginning to swallow up the forest around me. My finger quivered above the trigger as I fought this internal urge to fire at this monster, but a voice deep down inside my gut told me it wouldn't do any good. I lowered the rifle slowly from my eye and looked to my four-wheeler, then back to the creature, and decided I would make a mad dash. With trembling hands, I stood up slowly, grabbed the railing of the stand, and began making my way down the ladder, occasionally looking back and making sure the creature wasn't looking my way, and thank God it wasn't. My confidence was quickly cut off as I stepped off the last rung of the stand, and my size 12 boots crushed some of the bone-dry autumn leaves. It might as well have been a dump truck driving through a nitroglycerin plant. Whirling around, I realized the creature was looking right at me. We stared at each other across the wooded distance, and even though it was 30 degrees Fahrenheit, I was sweating through my heavy winter clothes. I thought about my wife, my farm, my dog, and my life, and decided I wasn't dying today if I could help it. Before I knew it, I was running towards my ATV. Thorns were cutting my face and ripping at my clothes as I ran. My gun was bouncing uncomfortably against my back as I felt blood trickle down my face from the cuts, and praying I wouldn't trip over anything in my sprint. Arriving at my ATV, I groped through my pockets for the keys. Pulling the key from my pocket, I struggled to find the ignition switch, my hands shaking like a heavy smoker who hadn't had a light in a week. My spirit lifted as the engine roared to life, but reality kicked in as I turned around, and to my horror, all I saw was a massive polar white deer and bright yellow eyes reflecting off my ATV's taillights. Teeth bared and tongue flicking in and out, it let out the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard. I gunned the ATV and began tearing down the mountain. Rocks and dips in the road threatened to overturn the four-wheeler, but I knew I couldn't afford to slow my pace. I could hear heavy footsteps, sticks, and limbs breaking behind me. The creature was no more than 50 yards behind me, gunning down the mountain faster and faster. I finally reached the old packing shed I mentioned earlier, which signified I was almost to the bottom. Looking around, I realized the creature was nowhere in sight. There was nothing. My breathing slowed, and I stopped to listen. Nothing was stirring but the dying leaves in the treetops, holding on to dear life, swaying in the wind against the moonlight. I took one last look at the packing shed, and my heart sank to my boots. Peeking out from the side of the building was a deer skull and long skeletal hand. Holy fuck, I yelled as I took off again. I turned around as the creature came fully into view from behind the old broken-down building, and I still to this day don't understand why I did it. But I slammed on the brakes and turned and fired my rifle, hitting the creature square in the upper torso. The creature staggered slightly as dark fluid trickled from its wound, but all it did was touch the gaping hole with its massive clawed hand and looked at me smiling. To hell with this, I thought, as I hit the gas and barreled down the mountain. My truck's taillights came into view, and I knew salvation was near. Thank God I left my ramps down. I hit the ramps like a BMX rider in the X Games, and my four-wheeler came to a stop in my truck bed with a hard thud. Throwing my ramps into the bed and slamming my truck's tailgate shut, I fumbled for the truck keys and found them very quickly. Throwing my rifle in the passenger seat, I cranked the old beast of a truck over. My heart threatened to beat out of my chest until the truck finally started. Looking back through the mirror, I almost broke into tears as all I saw walking through the cloud of diesel smoke my truck had emitted, like a phantom in a graveyard, was the monster. my backpack in its left hand. It cocked its head to the side as it approached my truck, and I swear to God, it smiled. It fucking smiled. Dirty, rotten brown teeth were shown in my lights as it stalked closer and closer. I floored the old pickup and didn't slow down until I hit the main road, tears streaming down my face as I drove the long trip home. I haven't bothered telling anyone this story because no one will believe me. I thought sharing this here was my only hope of getting this out here. Believe it or not, I went back a few times that season, but only in groups of 3. I felt awful for not telling my fellow companions about what I saw due to their safety, but I knew they would laugh me off. The day after this happened, I contemplated whether or not this actually happened. Could I have just imagined this? I got my answers that night as I checked my wireless game camera from the comfort of my living room. That night, after I left, at 10:30 p.m., the creature came into view on my trail camera, and it hung my backpack on the bottom rung of the ladder of the tree stand. It turned towards the camera, and it smiled that god-awful smile again before smashing the camera to pieces. I now know why animal sightings in the orchard are so rare, and I don't know what I'm going to say when I'm asked if we should renew the lease this year. I can't get this experience out of my head. I want to go back, but I know that monster is still up there somewhere. All I know is that when I lay in bed at night, all I hear in my head are Rob's words. A monster could walk down out of there anytime. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Descent into the Unknown for more terrifying stories. Hello everyone. It's been just over a year since I recounted the strange experience I had hunting in the old orchard. I would like to say that things calmed down and that I came up with a rational explanation for what I experienced. But that couldn't be further from the truth. My encounter in the orchard has left me just as curious as terrified. I spent the following weeks researching what I encountered online, and I was shocked to find that a Wendigo describes the abomination I encountered to a T. I read about the old Native American legends and descriptions from modern day about the beast, and I was in shock and awe. As the winter passed and spring arrived, I failed to get the Wendigo out of my mind. No one in my hunting club seemed to care or notice the creature's presence. I assume it's because only a few of us hunt there, and no one hunts in the stand I do, which is miles up in the mountain. After a lot of back and forth in my head, I decided I had to go talk to Rob, one of the founders of our club, and the one whose words still ring in my head. A monster could walk down through those woods at any time. One warm spring day, this past April, I finished feeding my cattle, jumped in my old Ford pickup, and made the drive to Rob's house, a small but well-kept bright blue house just outside of town. As I approached, I saw Rob sitting in his lawn chair, admiring his handiwork, a well-manicured lawn with perfect stripes for as far as I could see. He sat with his legs crossed, sporting a red Budweiser can in his left hand. As I pulled into the driveway, a warm smile crossed his face. Rob was always like a grandfather figure to me, always willing to talk and help me with any problem I may be having. The sun was high in the sky, and it shone brightly off his white Santa Claus beard. "Hey there, son," "I'm surprised you're not in the hayfields yet," Rob said in his gruff but welcoming tone. I chuckled to myself and replied, "That's one fine-looking yard, Rob." His smile widened even more, and I could tell Rob's yard was one of his great labors of love in life. "Yeah, I reckon so. At least it's green this year. Hopefully we don't have a drought like last summer," he said. I enjoyed the small talk and meaningful conversations he and I always shared, but I had to force myself to ask him about what I saw last year. I wasn't even sure if he knew about the creature, although the stand I hunted in was his, and he used to be in it every weekend during hunting season up until his knee surgery a few years ago. Adjusting my sunglasses to help block the sun, I said, "Rob, can I ask you something?" His face dropped slightly, as I had never really been too serious with him before, but he agreed. "Sure, son. What's on your mind?" "Rob, have you ever seen anything strange in the orchard?" My voice lacking the confidence it normally had. A light breeze blew through across his porch, filling my nose with the smell of freshly cut lawn clippings. "You saw one of them, didn't you?" he asked in a low tone. "Christ, I haven't seen one in nearly 20 years. I thought no one would ever have to experience seeing one of those ugly freaks of nature again." Part of me was terrified because now I knew the Wendigo did exist, but another part of me was relived because I didn't imagine what I saw. My voice trembling, I said, "So you've seen the Wendigo?" Rob did his best to give me a reassuring smile, but I could see through it. "I don't know what the hell they are called, but all I know is this. I still see them in my nightmares, son. I lost control of my emotions and spilled my heart out to Rob, telling him what I saw, how it chased me down off the mountain, and how my gunshot literally didn't faze it whatsoever. I was nervous, thinking Rob would look at me like I was a lunatic, but he just nodded his head and listened intently to each and every detail. "Rob," I asked in an almost whisper, "are those things the reason why we don't see any deer in the orchard?" Rob looked at me sympathetically. "No, son. The protector of that mountain is why we don't see many deer there." I looked at the old man with wide eyes and confusion. "The protector?" Rob bent down and grabbed another can from his cooler, snapping the tab upwards and taking a long sip before offering me one, which I declined because it was only noon and I had a lot more work to do that day. "You might want to take a seat, son," he said. "Let me explain." I sat down in Rob's plastic green lawn chair, and he emptied the can before letting out a sign and beginning. "Back in the 70s and early 80s, before you were born, I encountered one of those things late one evening during rifle season. I was sitting in the same stand you hunt in now. It charged me from the brush and tackled me, thrashing me with its antlers and scratching me nearly to death with its long, dirty claws. My gun was long gone as it made sure to knock it from my grasp immediately. Those things are smart, kid. Don't underestimate them." My life flashed before my eyes. I couldn't wrap my brain around something this evil existing in our world. But before the creature could take me out for good, a loud roar echoed from the forest above us. A roar that made my heart pound and teeth chatter. With what little strength I had left, I turned my head to see the biggest black bear I've ever seen in my life charging towards us. The Wendigo, as you call it, barely had enough time to react before the bear pounced on it and tore it limb from limb. Now, son, I've seen some 400 to 500 pound bears in my day, but this one was way bigger than that. As impossible as it may seem, I swear on my mom's grave that its eyes were blood red and his teeth were 3 times as long and sharp as the average bear. It didn't escape unscathed, though. The creature managed to bite and claw the bear to the point where I thought it would surely die from blood loss, but he never quit. He wouldn't quit on me. Finally, the bear put his massive paw on the creature's chest, bit down on its neck, and tore its head from its body. Black blood shot across the ground and through the air like a geyser. I almost vomited at the sight and smell of it. After I regained my composure and my breathing relaxed, I looked the bear dead in the eyes and said thank you. It nodded its massive head before dragging the lifeless creature up into the national park and disappearing from sight. He's the reason we don't see any deer, I'm guessing. To be as big as he is, he's got to eat damn near everything that moves. But I owe him my life, kid. I wouldn't be standing here today if it wasn't for him. I call him Big Grim. My eyes had to be as big as dinner plates. I didn't know what to say or think. I looked for any indication that Rob was fucking around with me, but his normally bright demeanor was stoic and somber. I muttered, Rob, if you know those things exist, why the hell do you help me convince the club members to renew the lease there? Rob was silent for a moment before speaking. To protect him and his home, he simply said. At this point, my nerves were beyond shot, and I gestured towards the old retro cooler by Rob's side. He handed me a beer, and we drank in silence for a while before he cleared his throat and spoke again. He saved my life, son, and thanks to you and a couple other guys in the club, that land is protected and treated with respect. Big Grim saved my life, and the only way I know to protect him is to keep the land in our hands, not let a bunch of worthless poachers come in and wipe him out. Rob let out a sigh before bowing his head. The only thing that worries me is that those things are back. They are bloodthirsty and seemingly running those hills again. Big Grim has to be old, or maybe even dead by now. That was a long time ago, son. Good things always come to an end. If he's not there anymore, it isn't safe to set foot in those woods. I finished off my beer and asked Rob, did you ever see him after your encounter with the Wendigo? He smiled slightly, like he was lost reminiscing about better days. Yeah, I would occasionally see him watching me from the park boundary. He never approached me, but it was almost like he was watching over me. Yeah, somehow, even after experiencing what I did, I felt safer in those woods than in my own home. But I haven't seen him in 10 years or more, ever since my old bones gave out. I couldn't hike up to that stand now if my life depended on it. That's your stand now, son. Take care of it and enjoy it. Rob's voice almost broke as he held back tears, frustrated that Father Time took his favorite pastime away from him. I thanked Rob for opening up to me and taking the time to tell his story. I went to get up from the lawn chair before I felt a strong grip on my shoulder. Rob leaned in close to my ear and whispered, whatever you do, be cautious going into the orchard, son. There may not be anyone or anything there to protect you. I nodded and shook Rob's strong and calloused hands before making my way to the truck and driving home. Summer came and went like dust in the wind. I lost track of time with all the hay I had to bale and all the cattle I tended to. Next thing I knew, the nights were colder and the trees faded from an emerald green to beautiful mixtures of yellows and oranges. Rob and I convinced the club to renew the orchard lease for yet another year. And even though a part of me was scared to go into those woods, the other part of me was excited for the upcoming hunting season. I hunted a few times that fall, but only down low in the orchard, closer to civilization and closer to my truck. I wanted with all my heart and soul to figure out the mystery of the Wendigo and maybe see if Big Grim still roamed this forest, but I couldn't muster the courage to make the hike up to the top stand. December rolled around and hunting season was nearing its conclusion. I only had a week left. It was now or never. About 2 weeks ago, I packed up my old Ford truck and my hunting rifle, and I made the drive over the mountain, admiring the light snowfall that had turned the mountain into a winter wonderland. I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my gut, telling me to turn back and leave this mystery well enough alone. But I knew if I ever wanted to get a good night's rest again, I had to face my fear. I pulled into the orchard and shut off my loud, rattling diesel engine. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my gear and locked the pickup before setting out on what I couldn't help but think could be my last journey. I noticed that there were several deer trails zigzagging their way across the freshly fallen snow, which lightened my spirits. But the further I walked, the less numerous they became. As I arrived at the stand, I noticed the forest was deadly quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. Goosebumps formed on my arms under my heavy clothing as I realized silence in the forest is bad, very bad. The first half mile I hiked was pleasant. I took in the scenery and watched birds and squirrels scurry across the ground, searching for their last-minute meals before darkness fell. I climbed the old rusty ladder and got myself settled into the stand. I checked my phone, which unsurprisingly had no signal. Every snap of a twig or every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I was constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of wildlife or the Wendigo. But as the minutes turned into hours, nothing appeared. I checked my phone once more, and it read 4:50 p.m. I knew within 30 minutes that it would be dark, and there was no way in hell I was sitting up here miles into the forest in the dark. I grabbed my backpack and gun and began descending the stairs. Each clang from my heavy boots against the cold, rusty metal sounded like an elephant trampling through a glass factory. I took one last look around and whispered to myself, "See you next year, my friend," before beginning my hike down the mountain. My walk down the path was much slower than my hike up, because with the fading light and poorly kept trail, I didn't want to risk tripping over fallen branches or logs. A nagging feeling in my gut began to surface, as I swore I could hear footfalls to my left, but each time I stopped to listen, they stopped as well. Must be my boots echoing against the ground, I thought. No more than 10 steps further into my hike, I heard rapid footsteps flanking me on the left. Just as I turned to investigate, I was knocked backward at least 20 feet, my back slamming hard against an uprooted tree, knocking the wind out of me. My gun slipping from my shoulder and rolling down the hill several feet away. My eyes fluttered open just in time to see a hulking, slender figure slinking towards me in the last rays of sunlight. I was more than lucky last time to escape with my life, and I go and do this. The Wendigo chuckled to itself in the nastiest, most guttural tone I've ever heard before, getting down on all fours and slowly stalking towards me. Those empty, dark eye sockets looking straight into my soul, and that deer skull cocked sideways, staring at me. This is it. I thought, how could I be so stupid for returning here? I attempted to scramble backwards, but my dislocated shoulder wouldn't allow me to put any weight on it, and all I could do was gasp in pain and watch the horrible abomination that had haunted my dreams take my life away from me. The creature stopped inches from my face before licking my cheek with its long, forked, snake-like tongue. I gagged at its rotten-smelling breath, and I closed my eyes, preparing to take my last breath. My mind was screaming at me to at least try and put up some sort of fight. If I was going to die at the hands of this monstrosity, I wanted to go out guns blazing. I was finally broken from my trance. With a wince of pain, I pushed down with my hands and landed a hard kick under the creature's lower jaw with my boot, causing the creature to hiss in a loud, raspy tone. I put all my body weight on my good arm and landed a few good kicks to the creature's torso before scrambling backwards the best I could and using the fallen tree as a crutch to help me stand. The Wendigo's vacant eyes seemed to burn with hatred at me, although they lacked pupils. My mind was slowly reverting back to all the research I had done on the creature the last year, and I remembered. Fire was the best way to kill a Wendigo, or at least keep it at bay and maybe, by some chance, help me escape. My backpack was laying beside me just a few feet, and I dove for it, my hands shaking trying to open the zipper. Unfortunately for me, Rob was absolutely correct when he said these creatures were incredibly smart, as if it knew I had a trick up my sleeve. The monster grabbed my left arm and dug its long, dirty claws into my forearm, causing me to grunt loudly in pain. Blood trickled out from each puncture wound like a leaky kitchen faucet. My hands trying desperately to turn the plastic knob, releasing just enough gas to spark the torch. My right hand clutching the small propane torch I had stashed in my pack. I pulled it out and swung as hard as I could, connecting with the creature's temple. This time, the Wendigo recoiled for a second, whether due to the pain of my blow to its head or the fact it associated the item with fire. I'm not sure. This is how it ends, I thought to myself, as the creature pinned me down and got nose to nose with me before doing something that paralyzed me. As I was about to pull the trigger to ignite it, the Wendigo roared in anger and knocked the torch from my grasp. I heard it rolling across the forest floor before making a loud clang as it landed against my gun, feet away from me and sadly out of my reach. It spoke in Rob's gruff voice. Not an exact match, but close enough for me to recognize it.
A monster could walk down anytime, son.
It snickered. The creature raised its bony clawed hand, about to end my life once and for all, before a deafening roar filled my ears. The sound reverberated across the forest floor, making the ground shake. The Wendigo's head jerked around to the left, trying desperately to pinpoint where that monstrous roar had came from. I looked too, and what my eyes landed on was truly a sight to behold. What stood on top of the ridge just above my tree stand was something out of a MonsterVerse movie. Big, grim, I softly whispered to myself. A massive black bear stood just 50 yards away from us. The bear was at least 200 to 300 pounds heavier than any bear I'd seen in the wild or on any television show. Jet black fur glistened under the moonlight, although I noticed the creature's chin was gray, and the animal had a few stripes of graying fur running down its spine. Saliva splattered in every direction from the creature's mouth as it roared angrily towards the Wendigo and me. Blood-red eyes stood out brightly in the darkening forest as they locked on my attacker. The bear terrified me to the core, and I inwardly prayed that Big Grim had come to save me and not to aid the disgusting creature pinning me down. Big Grim stood on his hind legs, and his height had to be over 11 to 12 feet easily. The bear looked skyward and let out one last monstrous roar before charging on all fours towards the Wendigo. The Wendigo released my shoulders and turned to face its opponent, causing me to gasp and cough in relief as my body recovered from the pain. The Wendigo lowered its head, pointing its massive antlers towards the bear, but Big Grim had too much momentum as it tackled the creature, and the impact was so fierce that the two creatures stumbled 30 feet past me. I heard bones crack as the two collided, and I could hear the leaves and foliage cracking loudly under their weight. Both creatures recovered quickly, and the Wendigo hissed and swiped its clawed hand against the side of the bear's face, causing it to emit a loud roar of anger. Big Grim retaliated with a bite to the Wendigo's arm, jerking the towering creature sideways and onto the ground. The hissing and roaring from these two creatures made me feel like I was in some fucked up sci-fi movie. The Wendigo got to its feet and jumped on the massive bear's back, biting at his neck. Big Grim shook violently, trying to throw the creature off, but to no avail. I snapped myself back into reality, realizing I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. This creature came to help me, and all I've done is sit here and watch. I crawled gingerly towards my gun and pack. Raising the rifle to my eye, I shakily tried my best to aim at the Wendigo's head, although it was a challenge due to my shoulder being knocked out of place and the constant movement of the two beasts. Finally, Big Grim sat on his haunches and gave me the shot I needed. A loud gunshot rang out through the forest as the Wendigo screamed in pain and fell backwards on the ground. Big Grim had blood pouring from several deep gouges around his head and sides. The bear turned abruptly, and with one hard swipe of its massive paw, it knocked the Wendigo across the ground and into a nearby locust tree. The Wendigo shook its massive antlered head in an attempt to regain focus as the bear charged it once again. Big Grim just missed his target as the Wendigo dodged his assault and rolled to the side, causing the bear to sideswipe the tree, pointing its massive antlers directly at the bear's side. The Wendigo gored the bear, and its antlers gouged 2 puncture wounds in the bear's side, causing it to roar in intense anguish. I shot the Wendigo again in the back, causing it to jerk around and hiss at me, its long tongue spitting that nasty saliva in every direction. The Wendigo swiped and clawed at Big Grim's hide, tearing fur and muscle off with every blow. My last shot rang out, hitting the creature dead in the chest, but just like last time, the creature just smiled that disgusting smile at me, and it covered the wound with its hand, attempting to stop the small amount of dark blood trickling from the bullet hole. The Wendigo's fun was short-lived though. Big Grim had enough to swiftly take its paw and swipe it across the Wendigo's lower body, taking its feet out from under the creature. The bear shakily got to its feet and pinned the Wendigo down to the ground, getting face to face with it. His blood-red eyes looking into those deep black sockets before roaring into the creature's deer skull, spraying it with hot saliva before biting down hard on the creature's neck and shaking his head around violently until I heard a loud snap ring out through the forest. The Wendigo lay twitching on the ground, scattering snow and leaves in every direction. Big Grim was real, and he had been here all along, protecting us from the Wendigo. Although the creature was likely near death, I heard its ghostly voice whisper,
"This is only the beginning. There are many more of my kind in this forest, and someday we will reclaim this land as our own."
The creature turned its head slowly towards me and said,
"He won't be able to save you forever,"
before being swiftly cut off by the bear, crushing its skull with one final blow. Big Grim slowly stood up and released its hold on the Wendigo, limping a few feet away from us before lying down, his breathing labored. Darkness had completely enveloped the forest by this point, and I just laid on my side a few feet from the Wendigo and the giant bear. My mind was racing, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. Rob hadn't lied to me. His story was true. I looked over at the bear, who I feared had died from his injuries, but I still saw his massive body rising and falling with each breath, although I feared the Wendigo would somehow spring back up from its injuries and kill us both. Other than my shoulder, I had recovered somewhat and had the strength to get to my feet and limp over to my backpack. I knew I had to do one last thing before stumbling out of these woods. I found the torch and dug under the freshly disturbed snow and gathered as many leaves as I possibly could, covering the Wendigo's body before finally lighting the torch and watching the creature's body slowly burn into ashes. The creature twitched and writhed on the ground as it burned. Big Grim noticed what I was doing and got to his feet. I couldn't tell if the creature was happy or angry at my action, due to the fact that his gaze was always menacing with those red eyes and huge set of teeth. The massive bear looked down at the burning monster and snarled, saliva dripping from his mouth, almost enjoying the sight of this evil creature suffering. The smell from the burning creature was enough to make me vomit, but I covered my mouth and nose long enough until the creature was nothing more than a pile of ashes. I placed the torch back in my back and removed my flashlight from the front pouch. Shining it towards the bear, I noticed he had made his way a few feet away from me, walking slowly in the direction of the park. I said wearily, "Thank you." The bear stopped mid-stride and twisted back around before nodding at me and walking back into the darkness. Deep down, I knew Big Grim was getting older and his wounds would take longer to heal, but I prayed that in time he would recover. I watched him walk back to the park line, and just before he was out of sight, he stopped, rose onto 2 feet, and let out one last deafening roar into the dark winter sky before disappearing. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and limped the few miles back to my old pickup truck. After a few tries, I finally got the angry old diesel truck started and made my way back across the mountain and back to my farm. A few weeks have passed, and my wounds have mostly healed. My shoulder is finally back in place, and my life is seemingly back to normal. I think about what happened in the orchard every single day. But even though the Wendigo still terrifies me and makes me never want to go hunting in those woods again, I think I will continue to hunt and enjoy nature the way I always have. Nature has the power to restore balance, and I believe Big Grim is that power. The only thing that still haunts my dreams at night is what the Wendigo said. He can't save you forever. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Descent into the Unknown for more terrifying stories. Hello, everyone. About 5 months have passed since I encountered the Wendigo again and had my first run-in with Big Grim in the orchard. I understand that most of you probably can't wrap your heads around the events that I described in my last post, nor can I, for that matter. I would like to say that I have finally found normality and peace with it all, but unfortunately, that's not the case. It was only 2 short months after my horrific and awe-inspiring experience that my life would be turned upside down once again. After healing from my injuries and getting my life back in order, I started researching and trying to understand the phenomenon that was Big Grim. Sure, the Wendigo is still on my mind. How could it not be? But I've researched the hell out of those disgusting creatures, and I have a better understanding of who and what they are. After returning home, all I could think about was trying to figure out who Big Grim is. I have literally searched every corner of the internet trying to explain the giant bear, but there is no logical explanation for a black bear being that size. Even the biggest Kodiak and grizzly bears ever recorded aren't even close to his size. I don't know what to believe anymore. The only thing I know is that he is an anomaly, a force beyond human understanding, a god, a protector of the forest. I still see his blood-red eyes every night when I try to fall asleep after a long day of farm work. The odd thing is, I'm not afraid. Big Grim, to me, is like a friend. Although he doesn't terrify me, the memory of what happened that cold December evening does. January passed, and the cold temperatures and snow enveloped my small town. Life trudged on, just like it always had. But no matter how hard I fought it, I couldn't resist the urge to go and tell Rob about everything that transpired that night. Rob hadn't been in the best health over the past few months. His legs and body were failing him, and he wasn't getting out as much as he normally would. Rob and I would always see each other a few times a week at the local gas station, early in the morning on his daily coffee and newspaper run. But now I was lucky to see him once a week. One cold February afternoon, after finally getting the remaining corn chopped off my fields, I drove my trusty old Ford pickup over to that familiar bright blue house that Rob lived in. I always thought it was sad, looking at his yard this time of year. As I previously mentioned, Rob always kept his yard perfect, green, and well kept. But during the winter, it looked just like any old yard around my town, brown and begging for warmer weather and sunny days. I parked in the backyard because my old pickup leaks oil from time to time, and I didn't want to stain his asphalt driveway that he always got sealed every fall. His old retro cooler and lawn chair sat empty and lonely on his front porch, awaiting the arrival of spring. I knocked a few times before his door slowly swung open, and I saw my old friend, his smile beaming off his cheeks. He shook my hand firmly while speaking in that gruff but reassuring voice. "Hey there, son. How the hell have you been?" Rob's smile was always so warm and comforting that I almost forgot what I drove to his house to tell him. I chuckled and replied, "I've been working my life away, just like always. How have you been, old man?" Rob looked down at his knees, both of which had heavy braces on them, and somberly said, "I'd be a lot better if my fucking body would stop giving up on me." I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "You're a tough son of a bitch, Rob. You'll be back out hunting with me and the boys soon." He chuckled, and the smile returned to his face. "I'm going to try my damnedest, son." Rob and I made small talk for about a half hour or so before I finally had the courage to look him in the eye and say, "Rob, I know you'd never lie to me, but that story you told me about Big Grim was very unbelievable. But I have to admit, I realize it was true." Rob's face contorted into a puzzled look. "What do you mean?" he asked, in a serious yet confused tone. "I saw him," I said weakly. "What?" Rob said, almost shouting at me. I got up from Rob's old lazy boy recliner and walked towards his beer fridge before asking him if I could have one. "Bring the six-pack, son," he said. I told Rob the entire story of my encounter this past December. He never interrupted me, just nodded his head from time to time, allowing me to convey every detail to him. When I was finished, he looked down at his old, outdated yet clean carpet floor and said, "I'll be damned. He's still alive." I nodded my head and said, "Yes, sir. He's alive and well." Rob looked out his front window and had one of those 1,000-yard stares. There was a twinkle in his eye, a small tear reflecting out of the corner of his right eye. Rob sighed and patted my shoulder before saying, "I don't know how to explain him, son. But all I know is that he saved not only my life, but one of my best pals as well. I have to thank him." My eyes widened, and I half stuttered as I replied, "You aren't serious, are you?" Rob was silent for a moment before looking me dead in the eyes and saying, "Look, son, I'm not sure how long I have left on this earth, but what I do know is that I wouldn't have made it this long without his help. I have to see him one last time. I have no idea what came over me. I had no intentions of returning to that cursed forest anytime soon, but my love and respect for Rob overcame my logic. I just nodded my head once and said, "When are we going?" Rob and I finished the 6-pack of ice-cold Budweisers, and he stood up and hobbled over to the back door and said, "Let's go tomorrow evening." My jaw almost hit the floor. I couldn't believe, after experiencing what he did and hearing about what I went through, that he would even consider stepping foot in those woods again. I cleared my throat before shakily saying, "Rob, you said it yourself. You're not able to make it to your old stand anymore." Rob somberly looked at the floor for a moment before looking back up at me with a shit-eating grin. "You've still got your four-wheeler, don't you?" I wanted to lie and tell Rob I sold it or something, but I just couldn't tell someone who I've looked up to for almost my entire life a lie. I lowered my head and replied, "Yes, sir." Rob chuckled and opened his back door, filling his house with a blast of cold winter air, which surprisingly felt good on my skin. I was anxious, nervous, and worried thinking about Rob and I going to the orchard by ourselves. I stood up off of Rob's outdated, yet comfortable sofa and opened my lips to speak, but nothing came out. I just couldn't convey the words I needed to say to convince Rob that this was a bad idea. Finally, after watching Rob gaze into his backyard for a while, I spoke up. "Rob, this is a bad idea. You know it, and I know it. That creature told me there were more of them in the orchard before Big Grim killed it. We don't stand a chance if they attack us." I was about to continue before Rob swiftly cut me off, taking me by surprise, because normally Rob was gentle and soft-spoken, but there was a fiery determination in the old man's eyes. "Look, son, I understand where you're coming from, but that bear gave me the chance to experience all the wonderful things life has to offer. Meeting my wife, raising my beautiful daughter and son, and watching my grandchildren grow up. Without him, I wouldn't have witnessed any of it. I owe it to him to thank him one last time, and I'm going to the orchard, with or without you." I stood in Rob's living room speechless. My mind was racing. Rob turned back to his backyard, and I'm sure he was thinking about the days gone by. I sighed heavily before saying, "Well, you're not going alone. I'm in." Rob turned around again and smiled before saying in a genuine tone, "Thank you, son. I had one nagging question on my mind, though. How the hell are we going to protect ourselves if we see one of those things?" Rob gestured for me to follow him, and I did. We walked across his now snow-covered driveway to a storage shed, which contained his lawnmower and his two beautiful restored old pickup trucks, along with every tool you could possibly imagine. Rob went over to the far right corner, which contained a weathered old cabinet, before opening it. He said softly, "This should do the trick. I came up with this little invention myself." I stared at what I could only assume was a homemade redneck flamethrower, a propane tank with a blowtorch mounted at the end. I excitedly said, "Damn, Rob, that's awesome." Rob chuckled to himself. "I've had this thing stored away for 10 years or more, but it's time to finally put it to the test." After showing me how it worked, I looked at my old friend and said, half jokingly and half seriously, "Why the hell can't we go in the morning when there's plenty of daylight left? I can do my farm work when we get home." Rob shook his head before replying, "Sorry, son, I have a doctor's appointment in the morning. The doctor has to check and see how the old ticker is doing." "Okay, fine," I said in a defeated tone. Rob and I went over the game plan for the following afternoon before I jumped in my truck and went back to the farm. I worked later than normal that night, making sure I had everything done to free up enough time for me to accompany Rob the next day. I arrived at Rob's house around 3 p.m. the next evening. Rob had his beautiful 1996 F-250 Eddie Bauer edition pickup running in the driveway when I pulled in. I jumped out of my truck and said, "No, Rob, we can take my truck. The four-wheeler is already loaded." Rob laughed before patting my shoulder and saying, "No, you are already doing me a favor by coming along. We can take my truck this time." Not wanting to waste any more daylight arguing with him, I unloaded my four-wheeler and drove it onto the back of Rob's truck. Rob loaded the flamethrower on the back as well. I looked at Rob and said, "What gun did you bring?" He pulled out his .38 special pistol and flashed it proudly in front of him. I smiled and teased him. "I got you beat, old man," I said, sliding my .44 Magnum revolver out of its holster and waving it at him. We drove in near silence for the first 20 minutes of the trip, before Rob suddenly began rambling on about current events and sports, like we weren't on a suicide mission. I ignored my anxiety and chatted with him for the remainder of the trip. We arrived at the orchard around 4 p.m., and I wasted no time unloading the four-wheeler and strapping Rob's invention to the front bracket. Rob struggled, but eventually got seated on the back, and I mounted the ATV myself. I looked over my shoulder and whispered to him, "Where are we headed, Captain?" He replied gruffly, "You know damn well where we're going." Without another word, we drove in silence up the rough trail, maneuvering around fallen branches and rocks. Finally, after a 10 to 15-minute ride, I saw Rob's old tree stand come into view. I stopped and turned around to see Rob with the biggest smile spread across his aging face. "Look at it, son. Just how I remembered it." I couldn't help but smile to myself. It warmed my heart to see Rob so happy and back in his element. We both got off my four-wheeler and looked around for a while. The forest was eerily quiet, and my stomach was in knots, but I let Rob soak in the moment. After a few minutes, Rob limped over to a massive oak tree and sat down, gesturing for me to sit with him, and I did. We sat in silence, soaking in nature's beauty. A cold wind whipped across my face as I prayed internally that this afternoon would pass quickly without conflict. The minutes slowly ticked by, and I was beginning to think that Rob wouldn't get his chance to see the massive bear again. I mean, hell, I bet Big Grim didn't even realize we were there, and I sure as hell hoped the Wendigo didn't. As the sun slowly started sinking below the horizon, I felt Rob hit me in the ribs harder than I thought he was capable of. I looked towards him and followed where his hand was pointing. I squinted towards a thicket to our left, and I couldn't believe it. Two red, burning eyes stood out amongst the thorns and branches. My heart thudded in my chest as I heard Rob whisper to himself, "Hey there, old friend." The branches shook as Big Grim slowly blundered towards us out into the clearing in front of us. He was just as massive as I remembered. He locked his gaze on us and continued forward. I stood up and wrapped my hands around Rob's forearm, helping him stand. I looked at Rob, and I saw a tear trickling down out of the corner of both his eyes. His hands shook as he softly waved at his old friend and savior. Big Grim stopped just feet away from us. I could feel his hot breath on my skin as he looked at us, more so at Rob than at me. I was absolutely awestruck, because for the first time since I laid eyes on the giant bear, I saw the smallest hint of emotion on his face. His eyes widened just a bit, before slowly softening up in recognition. He recognized Rob, I could tell. The bear took 2 steps forward and raised his snout, sniffing the air and softly groaning like a dog that hadn't seen his master in a very long time. Rob was in tears by this point. I smiled, and for the first time that day, I was glad that we came here. Rob needed this closure, and I knew it. Rob shakily put his old, weathered hand out to touch the bear's head, before 3 bone-chilling screams rang out through the darkening forest. One from my left, one from Rob's right, and the other from way up the mountain in front of us. It was like the forest suddenly came alive and was swallowing us up. Big Grim stood as still as a statue, before suddenly turning around abruptly and snarling. I watched his sides quickly rise and fall, and I could tell the bear was breathing heavily. Big Grim knew something was coming. Rob and I exchanged worried glances, and I instinctively pulled my .44 from its holster. Rob had his hand on his .38, and we both had our heads on a swivel, looking in every direction. What we saw next was a nightmare on steroids. boundary, we could see 3 tall, slender, disgusting figures slowly making their way towards us. They were flanking us in a triangle pattern. 3 Wendigos made their presence known. All 3 were of different sizes. The one on my left was a shorter one. I'm 6'3", and this one looked to be around my height. Some white fur covered most of its body, along with a massive set of horns. The one to our right was about the size of the Wendigo I encountered just weeks before. It was 7 to 8 feet tall and brown in color, but the one standing the furthest away was the scariest of all. Jet black fur covered its body, and it had snow-white horns. This one was maybe just a foot or so shorter than Big Grim, so 10 feet tall or so, I'm guessing. I assumed this was the King Wendigo. While I was doing all my internet research on the creature, one article mentioned that every clan of Wendigo had an alpha, and this was it. Big Grim took a step forward and bellowed the loudest roar I'd ever heard. The Wendigo slowly walked towards us, all 3 snickering and flicking their snake-like tongues out. Drool leaked out of the corner of their mouths as they locked their gaze on us. Big Grim looked from left to right, preparing himself for possibly his last stand. The giant bear turned his massive head back towards Rob and me, and he repeatedly pointed his snout towards the 4-wheeler. Although he didn't speak, I understood fully what the bear was trying to tell us. Leave while you still can. I'll hold them off. Without thinking, I took a few steps towards the ATV, but Rob was planted in the same spot. The Wendigos roared and screamed towards us, and I yelled as loud as I possibly could. Rob, let's get the fuck out of here. Rob jerked his head around towards me with tears rolling down his face. I'm not leaving him. I stood there, trembling in shock. The screams from the Wendigo and the bellowing roars from Big Grim nearly made me cover my ears. Fuck, I whispered to myself. I took one last second to say a small prayer before walking up beside Rob, shoulder to shoulder, preparing for a bloody showdown. The King Wendigo sat down on a massive fallen log on top of the ridge before raising his right arm, pointing his long, nasty, bony hand towards us and shouting in a deep tone. "Kill them," the smallest Wendigo hissed. And Big Grim jerked his head around to the left and roared angrily, hot saliva splattering the trees and leaves around him. Big Grim took off on all 4s towards the beast. The Wendigo took a wide swipe at Big Grim's head, but the bear anticipated it, halting his run and causing the beast's hand to connect with a nearby branch. Big Grim stood on his hind legs, roaring into the sky, before swiping his massive paw across the Wendigo's face, knocking it backwards onto the ground. The bear opened its jaws unbelievably wide and bit down with its long, sharp teeth into the creature's leg, shaking his head around violently, attempting to remove the creature's limb. Just then, I saw a blur of brown fur and antlers fly by me, and the medium-sized Wendigo pounced onto Big Grim's back, scratching and clawing at the bear's head. Big Grim released his hold on the smaller one and began swatting his massive paws in every direction, attempting to knock the creature off him, but the Wendigo was fast and agile. Dodging each of the bear's blows, the creature bit down on the tender spot of the bear's neck, causing him to wince and roar loudly in anguish. Rob and I were snapped out of our trance by the sight and sound of our friend in intense pain. I ran over to the creatures and aimed my .44 directly at the Wendigo's head, but every time I attempted to pull the trigger, the movement of the 2 animals caused me to pause. I sure as hell didn't want to accidentally shoot Big Grim. Just then, a loud gunshot rang out, nearly making my eardrum rupture. The Wendigo howled in pain and fell backwards onto the ground. I turned to see Rob standing there, smoke trickling out of the end of his .38. Rob looked like an old gunfighter making his final stand in the Old West. By this point, the smaller Wendigo had recovered and was attempting to claw and bite at Big Grim. The creature hissed and dove at the bear's legs, attempting to trip him and get the upper hand. That plan proved futile, as Big Grim's long claws dug into the thin layer of skin on the creature's back, and the Wendigo was hoisted up in the air like a stuffed teddy bear in an arcade claw machine. Big Grim pulled the creature in close to him and roared into its ugly, deformed deer skull before swiftly biting down on the creature's neck, and with one jerk of his head, he ripped the Wendigo's head from its body, causing black blood to spray in every direction. Big Grim dropped the creature's head and body on the ground before proceeding to swipe and claw at it, ripping it into dozens of pieces, leaves and foliage flying around like a tornado. Rob and I were unloading round after round into the brown Wendigo, and although black blood was squirting out of the hideous creature's body, it just kept coming. Lowering my gun, I proceeded to reload it, but my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't get a grip on the ammunition in my pocket. Just then, I heard Rob yell out in pain. He was also trying to reload, but unfortunately for us, we both ran out at the same time. The Wendigo charged him, and Bull rushed him into the massive oak I mentioned earlier. Rob's eyes were fluttering, and blood was trickling out of his nose as he struggled to catch his breath. Fueled by anger and fury, I ran towards the beast and clubbed my pistol hard against the creature's temple. The Wendigo recoiled and shook its head around violently, trying to regain focus. I repeatedly smashed the cold metal of my gun against the creature's deer skull over and over, not realizing I should be taking this opportunity to reload. After several blows to the head, the creature bit down on my forearm and shoved me off of it, making me scream in pain as I rolled across the ground, leaves and dirt clinging to the blood dripping from my arm. My head was spinning from the creature's blow, and my hand lost its grip on my gun, and it flew across the forest floor out of sight. Big Grim froze and jerked his head around to see Rob and I lying on the ground, groaning in pain. The bear's blood-red eyes were burning in hatred towards the creature who was attempting to kill us. The giant bear spit the Wendigo's severed head out onto the forest floor, and with a deafening roar, charged the brown creature. The Wendigo turned around in an attempt to stop Big Grim's assault, but the bear tackled it, and I heard the two creatures' bodies collide hard with a sickening crunch. The bear and the Wendigo thrashed and rolled across the ground, both beasts biting and clawing at each other. The Wendigo swiped its bony hand across the bear's hide, ripping fur and tissue away each time. The bear retaliated by locking his jaws down hard on the beast's arm. The Wendigo screamed and punched Big Grim with its free arm, attempting to stop his assault. My eyes fluttered a few times as I regained focus. I saw Rob breathing heavily on the ground, and I could tell he was badly injured. I knew this was a stupid idea to come here. I thought I was doing the right thing by bringing Rob here to find peace and closure, but seemingly all I did was bring death on us both. My arm was leaking massive amounts of blood by this point, but I found the courage to army crawl across the ground and retrieve my pistol, half buried in leaves and foliage. I pulled 3 bullets out of my jacket pocket and loaded them into the chamber. I couldn't tell who was winning the fight because both the Wendigo and Big Grim had multiple deep wounds squirting blood across the forest. My vision fading in and out made it difficult to accurately aim my weapon, but Big Grim gave me a perfect opportunity for a shot by swiping his massive paw down onto the Wendigo's back and knocking it a few feet away from him. I fired all the shots in rapid succession directly into the creature's neck and chest area. Although I knew from experience that bullet wounds did little to harm these things, it seemed, along with its other injuries, that my shots slowed the creature down significantly. Big Grim looked out on his feet, his legs looking like jello. Rob, still unconscious, Sitting up against the oak tree, my heart sank as I couldn't tell if he was still breathing or not. The Wendigo was still struggling and attempting to stand. Big Grim was shakily trying to make his way towards the badly injured creature. I gritted my teeth and told myself, "Get your fucking ass up and keep fighting." For Rob, for Big Grim, I got to my feet and limped over to the ATV, picking up the flamethrower and turning the valve on. I aimed the blowtorch towards the Wendigo, and just before I lit it, the Wendigo swiped its arm at me, just missing its mark. The flamethrower hissed, and a giant stream of fire shot from the end of the torch directly into the disgusting creature's face. Fire enveloped the creature, causing it to scream so loud that I swore it shook the remaining dead leaves that were clinging desperately to the trees off onto the ground. The creature rolled and thrashed on the forest floor, fire burning every inch of rotten flesh from its body. It looked up at me with burning hatred as fire shot out from the creature's black eye sockets before its movement ceased. I collapsed onto the ground, cold sweat covering my aching body as I turned towards Big Grim, who stood behind me, snarling and salivating, staring down at the dead creature. I noticed that all the rolling around I'd done on the ground had actually been to my advantage. The dirt had packed my wounded arm and slowed the bleeding significantly. I smiled and looked over my shoulder at the monstrous bear and said, "Well, look at that big fella. I used a page out of your book." Big Grim grunted softly before turning around and locking eyes with the King Wendigo. The massive 10-foot creature stood smiling at us, slowly clapping its hands before laughing deeply and speaking.
Maybe I underestimated you three. You've dispatched my entire army. But make no mistake, you can't defeat me. And I will make sure none of you make it out of this forest alive.
Big Grim rose onto 2 feet and roared at the hulking monstrosity. The King Wendigo opened its jaws, revealing rows upon rows of jagged and rotting teeth, and screamed back at the bear. Big Grim lunged forwards towards the Wendigo, pushing it backwards with its massive paws. The Wendigo retaliating by kicking the bear hard in the stomach with its massive legs and feet. Big Grim recovered and swiped its paw hard across the creature's lower body, making it scream loudly. Grim attempted to stomp on the Wendigo's chest, but the Wendigo rolled out of the way and jumped onto Big Grim's back. This time, the bear struggled to keep his balance, because this Wendigo was far heavier than the previous ones. The Wendigo wrapped its long arm around the bear's throat and jerked the bear sideways, making him lose his balance. Big Grim fell hard onto his side, and the King Wendigo wasted little time biting his throat, attempting to end the bear's life. Groans and roars escaped Big Grim's throat, as the Wendigo had ripped enough meat and tissue off to expose bone. The bear attempted to regain his strength, but this Wendigo was far more powerful than the others. It was relentless. He attempted to regain his strength, but this Wendigo was far more powerful than the others. His legs gave out, and the bear crumbled onto the ground. With the little strength I had left, I grabbed the flamethrower and staggered over to the 2 creatures. The Wendigo's head jerked around as it heard the whoosh from the torch, the creature's back engulfed in flames, but to my horror, it continued its assault on the bear. A jolt of fear shot up my spine as I realized it didn't care if it died, as long as Big Grim went with him. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath before running full speed and tackling the Wendigo with all my might. The Wendigo released its hold on Big Grim, and we went flying across the forest floor. At this point, the creature's entire body was smoldering, and all of its fur had burnt off. The creature looked even scarier now, just a deer skull with bloody red tissue up and down its body. It stared me down before swiping its clawed hand across my face. Its nails left 4 deep cuts across my cheek, and I flew across the ground. My eyes fluttered open, noticing that, in my panicked state, I hadn't turned the flamethrower off. It ran out of propane, but not before starting a small forest fire. A ring of fire had circled around the Wendigo, and I knew that this was it. Surprisingly, I was at peace. I didn't die a coward. I fought to the end, and I fought for Rob and for Big Grim. As I was about to close my eyes one last time, I saw a black figure come rushing past me. Big Grim had found his second wind and was barreling down on the burning creature. The Wendigo tried to dodge him, but Big Grim stood on his hind legs and raised his massive paw over his head. And as he was falling forward, he swiped it hard across the Wendigo's neck and face. The 2 creatures collided, and the aftermath truly showed me just how powerful the bear was. He literally beheaded this beast with one blow. The Wendigo laid on its back, still burning, but with nothing but its windpipe holding its head on. Its head turned slightly to look at me before uttering one final statement in a ghostly and raspy tone.
You and your pet may have ended our reign in this forest, but there is a creature here that even we are afraid of. Now that we are gone, he will surely come for you, and when he does, there's nothing he can do to save you.
The creature's words were cut off as the fire enveloped what was left of its body. Snow began falling in rapid white sheets, and to my surprise, had began accumulating, and the fire had burnt out at the snow's icy touch. Big Grim had made his final stand, because after beheading the Wendigo, the bear had fallen forward and collapsed onto the ground, unmoving and possibly not breathing. I tried to stand but physically couldn't. My eyes closed, and I drifted off into a deep, peaceful sleep. I awoke sometime later to a pitch-black forest. The forest felt peaceful for the very first time. I tried to get my sense of direction, and I saw the four-wheeler a few yards away. I crawled to it and used its tire to lift myself up to a standing position. I fumbled through my pack and retrieved my flashlight, flicking it on and trying to find Rob. Rob hadn't moved. I hastily limped over to him and put my hand on his shoulder. I shook him lightly, and tears began to form in my eyes. I whispered, "I'm sorry," as my hot tears melted the snow beneath my boots. Rob grunted, and my heart skipped a beat. His eyes fluttered open, and I heard him weakly say, "For what, son? You and Big Grim just kicked some Wendigo ass." I wrapped my arms around the old man's neck, and I collapsed beside him. Rob was dazed and weak, but other than some small injuries, he was going to make it. He looked around and asked, "Where is he? Please, tell me he didn't die." I sighed and told Rob I thought Big Grim was gone. Rob shook his head and began to sob. "Damn it," he said. "I came here to thank him, and all I did was cause him to die. For me, for you." I patted the old man's shoulder again and told him, "He went out like a hero should." Just then, the beam of my flashlight finally landed on the massive bear's body. He was lying right where I last saw him. I stood up and extended my hand out to Rob, helping him to his feet. "Come on, let's say goodbye." Rob and I knelt down beside the massive bear, and I couldn't help but think what a beautiful and amazing creature Big Grim was. His body was missing fur and tissue in so many places, it made my stomach sick. Rob put his hand out, and I knew this is what he always wanted. To touch him, to lay his hand on the beast that saved his life all those years ago. Rob's hand patted the bear's head, and Rob affectionately stroked the bear's fur. He smiled and said, Thank you, my friend. I'll never forget you. Rob and I stood and turned to walk away before a bone-chilling growl echoed across the ground. We turned to see Big Grim looking at us, steam blowing out of his nostrils, his blood-red eyes gazing at us before standing up and gingerly walking towards us. Rob gasped and said, "God, you're still alive." Big Grim looked at us, and somehow, even though he looked scarier than ever, I could see compassion in his eyes. He cared for us in some way. He walked closer and looked into our eyes. Rob wearily said, as his voice broke, "Thank you, big fella." I said the same, and the bear nodded his head, the moonlight reflecting off his black and silver fur. Rob and I watched in awe as Big Grim slowly walked back toward the park boundary. He stopped just before he got to our old tree stand. He rose onto 2 feet, turning just his head around to look at us one last time before looking skyward and bellowing a loud roar into the sky before walking out of sight. It was over. Somehow, someway, we had all made it out of this ordeal alive. All of us were battered and bloody, bruised, but alive. Rob and I drove down, and after some effort, due to our injuries, got the 4-wheeler loaded. I drove us home due to Rob being worse off than me. Rob and I went to the hospital the next day and were treated for some broken bones, bad cuts, and scrapes. We told the doctors that a pack of coyotes had attacked us, and no one questioned it. Rob and I have talked about what happened that day a lot, and we both still can't believe what transpired. I know most of you will find our story hard to believe, and I don't blame you. Now that the Wendigos have been defeated, I thought my life would go back to normal, and my dreams would be free of the nightmares that lurk in the orchard. But that creature's words have stuck with me. What else is in that forest? There's still a threat there, and how can it be worse than those monstrosities? I'm not sure what to think, but all I know is that Big Grim is a hero. He fought for us, almost died for us, and asked nothing in return. I will make sure that the orchard stays in our control so that Big Grim can live out his days in peace and safety. I owe him that much. I pray every single night that he's okay. He was as close to death this time as I've ever seen him, and I'm still not sure how he made it. He's one tough son of a bitch. I do know that. Rob called me last night and asked what we should do about whatever is still lurking in the orchard. I didn't really know what to say. Most of you would advise me to never go in those woods again, but something is calling me and Rob back. Rob and I are planning to return to check on Big Grim and possibly prepare to challenge whatever entity remains in that forest after we are healed up. I told Rob that I don't think Big Grim can go through another battle like that again, at least not for a long time until he is healed. But before Rob hung up the phone, he uttered one last thing to me. "Son, the arrogance of man is thinking nature is in our control and not the other way around. Let them fight." I was silent for a moment before replying, "Yes, but this time we are joining the fight." If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Descent into the Unknown for more terrifying stories.